Greetings all. This is our third brief lecture, which is just to give some historical context for Beowulf as a poem, filling in the gaps and so forth, since I doubt many of you know very much about the poem's background. So, in our last talk, we discussed what a strange and puzzling narrative poem Beowulf could be. The world we live in, it's very different from the world lived in by Beowulf's original audience. But if human nature is something that stays forever the same, it's worth asking what it is about us that finds something like Beowulf potentially so appealing. So, some historical background. First off, how old is the poem? And actually, that's a pretty good question because we don't know. It's anywhere between 1,000 and 1,400 years old, which we know because it tells a story about people in certain Germanic tribes like the Geats and the Danes. We know that from other sources, those people actually existed. So at the earliest, this poem was composed around the 6th century, but the poem itself was first physically written down around 1000 AD. That original manuscript, though, by the way, no longer exists. It's gone. The only manuscript in which the poem does exist, something called the Noel Codex, is actually a copy of the original document. And I gotta say, the Codex is in pretty bad shape. We nearly lost the whole thing in 1731 due to a fire, but luckily we did manage to save the manuscript. Unfortunately, not before some of the pages were burned on the fringe. That's why your Haney translation has some odd ellipses in it about halfway through. That's where the fire destroyed the manuscript, so we don't actually know what those words really are. Likewise, just as we don't know how old the poem is, we don't know anything else about it either, except maybe what scholars have been able to glean from certain internal clues. For example, who's the author? Beats the hell out of me. There's none mentioned, so we just call him the Beowulf poet. We also don't know if Beowulf was originally a written poem or something that had existed in oral folk culture for centuries beforehand. We do know that the Anglo-Saxons were interested in monsters and wondrous creatures, and that's why the Beowulf poem was actually preserved. The Noel Codex, which has it, it contains several other stories besides Beowulf that are about wondrous creatures and fabulous monsters. But when we start talking about the Anglo-Saxons, there we're on more solid ground. In fact, we know much more about the Anglo-Saxons than we do about the Beowulf poem itself. For one thing, the Anglo-Saxons lived in England, and they spoke a language that we now call Old English. And actually, their language used to be called Anglo-Saxon until a bunch of medievalists realized, after several decades of intense philological scholarship, that what they spoke was actually just a much older variant of modern English, hence the name. But here, maybe you're noticing a certain geographic oddity. I just mentioned that Beowulf was written in Old English in England. The story it tells concerns tribes like the Danes and the Swedes who are located not in England, but in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. So, what gives? Well, luckily we know the answer to that too. You see, just before the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 6th century, the Romans abandoned their province of Britain, and that gave a lot of Germanic tribes the opportunity to emigrate. So, naturally, when they settled the island, they took their stories with them, including the story of Beowulf. That's actually where the name Anglo-Saxon comes from, by the way. Two of these migrating Germanic tribes were the Angles and the Saxons, and the name England is actually a changed version of Angleland. Some of you, too, might know more about the Anglo-Saxons than you realize, at least if you're fans of Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien, you see, he was a medievalist, and he borrowed quite heavily from medieval literature. His Riders of Rohan, for example, the Rohirrim, they're based almost point for point on the Anglo-Saxons. Now, there are some differences. For instance, Tolkien depicts his Rohirrim as illiterate, but the Anglo-Saxons, they had a thriving book culture, although mostly it was only the clergy who knew how to read. Likewise, in Tolkien, the Rohirrim, they love horses. They're the horse lords. But the Anglo-Saxons never used cavalry in battle. When they fought wars, they would fight almost entirely on foot. Plus, there are instances in the archaeological record that the Anglo-Saxons practiced slavery and much more rarely, possibly, human sacrifice. But Tolkien, he was a devout Catholic, and he thought these elements were just too pagan to include in the Lord of the Rings. Otherwise, though, the similarities between the Anglo-Saxons and the Riders of Rohan are amazingly parallel. especially in terms of material culture. For example, King Theoden's hall, Meduseld, is based on the Mead Hall Heroic from Beowulf. And in my PowerPoint picture, you see the film version of Eomer, the Marshal of the Mark, wearing a Sutton Hoo helmet, which is the single most iconic image of Anglo-Saxon culture, and it's crested right there with white horse tail. We also know that the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity between the years 590 and 660 AD, and their Christianization has led to one of the greatest debates about the Beowulf poem. How Christian exactly does the poem happen to be? You can argue it both ways, and the answer really affects what you think the poem means. On one hand, Beowulf has a lot of references to God, and whoever wrote the poem certainly knew the Bible a little bit. When Grendel starts attacking Heorot, he attacks the Mead Hall not only because drunken Vikings can be a bunch of loud, noisy assholes, it's specifically because, as we're told in line 90, Grendel hates the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings how the Almighty had made the earth. In other words, Grendel is enraged by hearing Book 1 of Genesis, and that's what launches him on his murderous rampage. Likewise, a poet tells us that Grendel was a descendant of Cain, another biblical story. Basically, Cain is the son of Adam and Eve, and he ends up murdering his brother Abel. When God finds out, he curses Cain. That curse apparently applies to Grendel and every other descendant of Cain's line. Finally, the poem also never mentions any of the pagan Norse gods, people like Odin or Thor. In fact, the poem has only one meager reference to pagan shrines. That's in line 175, but mentions them only to indicate how useless they are at stopping Grendel. The problem, though, with the Christian interpretation of the poem is that all the poet's biblical allusions, they come from the Old Testament. There isn't anything New Testament in Beowulf. There's nothing about Jesus, nothing about the Virgin Mary, or personal salvation, or anything like that. And Beowulf himself, as far as heroes go, he's far more pagan than Christian. For one thing, his number one goal in life is getting honor and glory. In contrast, Christianity emphasizes meekness and humility. Beowulf also pretty seriously believes in the value of revenge, and if you ever told him that you should turn the other cheek if somebody wrongs you, he'd laugh in your face, and then maybe kill you. We don't know. Maybe. So one of the running debates about Beowulf is whether it's a Christian poem or not, for what it's worth. For due date number 5, when we read Tolkien's essay, The Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien firmly believes that the poem is Christian, and so you'll get that perspective. For our course, however, we'll be focusing on the monsters. So, without further ado, let's get to the fun stuff.